Et Annett Busch nous rejoint donc de Trondheim en Norvège pour nous parler d'un projet artistique, une recherche artistique collective qu'elle mène en collaboration avec plusieurs personnes à partir d'un certain nombre de journaux, de magazines culturelles panafricaines et tricontinentales, et qui pose notamment cette question: qu'est-ce que ça veut dire depuis aujourd'hui de s'approprier ou de relire ces revues-là pour penser aussi bien notre présent que le temps dans lequel ces revues ont émergé. Et ça me paraît tout à fait important d'avoir cette contribution aujourd'hui, au-delà d'une présentation de différentes revues individuelles, parce que là, alors tout comme dans plusieurs des revues dont on a parlé, et où on retrouve souvent des collaborations entre des artistes, des auteurs. On a parlé du multilinguisme, on a parlé du fragment, on a parlé de ce caractère nécessairement composite, toujours inachevé, toujours en négociation, toujours en train d'être construite, donc en cours, en conflit, en précarité, toujours sur le mode du mouvement. Et du coup, le projet que va présenter Annett, d'une certaine manière, à mes yeux, essaie de hériter de ce mode de pensée et de fabrication collective qui permet d'une certaine manière pas qu'il y ait qu'une seule voix à la fois. Du coup, moi, je m'arrête et je te cède le micro et on va entendre plus qu'une voix.
Un grand merci.
Mais c'est pas encore tout de suite.
Un grand merci Lotte pour cette belle introduction et un grand merci d'être ici. Je profite, je crois, énormément de toutes vos expertises. Et je m'excuse, je dois changer en anglais. Je me sens pas tellement à l'aise en français. Je veux faire une petite introduction. Je vous dis quelques mots. Et puis, on va voir 15 minutes audio slideshow. Et encore une excuse, j'ai tout à fait oublié. Il y aura des contributions en anglais et j'ai oublié de donner aux traductrices le texte. Et bon, si vous avez des questions là après, on peut le discuter certainement. Il y a assez de l'image et je vous invite de peut-être aussi être perdu un peu dans la langue. Et puis on se retrouve. So I speak to you really not as an expert. I never specialized my research on any particular journal, and I speak from a quite undisciplined position without any discipline in my background or supporting my back. I gathered some very formative experience co-editing a magazine in the mid-90s until 2002, a German monthly pop culture magazine called Specs. And then I wanted to, I was quite young and not trained as a journalist or an editor, but this was very much part of the concept of that magazine, to experiment with different forms of expertise and to take pop culture as serious as an academic would do, but not keeping the scientific distance. On the contrary, to write within the power of being affected and with a certain urgency meant to develop a stance towards politics through culture or coming through music. And this approach was very much informed by Stuart Hall's concept of cultural studies, and one could see it as an attempt to translate this into a German context, but this is a very peculiar, half true maybe. In the very early 90s. And all this resonates for me when I read a question like, do magazine culture, what you raised before, and a question that has been raised in 1966 by the young Rashad Nyogi, founding editor of Transition, the magazine he started in Kampala in 1961, when he claims a difference between do cultures and don't cultures, and much more. This questions, do magazine culture, also refers to the fact that a magazine does not only live from its prominent writers or some texts that became famous or significant political or radical, or its beautiful innovative covers. Doing a magazine is also a praxis in itself to produce a recurring, changing frame for some sheets of paper, for a heterogeneous and sometimes contradicting selection of texts and images, something that remains necessarily incomplete through its mode of production, but that speaks of its time much more precise exactly because of this responsive momentum than, for example, a book. But of course, you know this all, and I guess this is also very much one of the reasons why we are here and why we are interested in magazines, I guess. People are connected over a certain period of time through a magazine, have been connected, speaking of pre-internet times, and the very fact that they were there, were part of it, speaks of something. And this something probably needs to be defined and needs to be pushed into the center, at least from time to time. Or, as the editor of Africa South, Ronald Segal, writes in his last editorial, I quote, "A newspaper or magazine is not merely a weight of paper and ink, a profit and loss account with accumulated assets or liabilities, even a little library of facts and opinions. It is a living creature which develops its individual personality, sometimes irresistibly itself, so that those who own or edit it find that they are not so much shaping its character as being shaped by it themselves. It carries the moods and the thoughts of those who have inhabited its pages, but alters these features with a life that it's all its own, so it grows distinct from its inheritance. Such a being one does not close down, one has to kill it. And he who started it and grown with it till the lives of publisher and published have inextricably intermingled, kills also a part of himself." End of quote. If I speak of a magazine as a frame, these lines by Segal resonate insofar as creating a strong frame doesn't mean to control what is within, but on the contrary, a strong frame allows the most possible movement and contradictions within that frame. And what happens between the lines, between pages, between the articles, in and through their juxtapositions can be as important as a strong opinion or an article, but also much more difficult to grasp or to define. What happens in between has to be invented, narrated. There is no pretext. And this being in between is something it's somehow the starting moment or the core of the Electronic Textures project. And there are different aspects of being in between. Being in between different time frames, zones, spaces, continents, but also being in between experts, artists, editors working together, collaborating, from the Latin collaborare. So what happens between people working together? Working with the knowledge of others also means to work in between the knowledge of others, to gather knowledge within being in between. And of course, the story and reading the story changes, depending who's reading it, from where, and so on. So there is a growing and changing bunch of people working in different directions, and with this project of electronic textures. And what holds them together is an interest in the magazines that have been published on the African continent in between the mid-50s and mid-80s or abroad, but then with a strong relation to the continent. And what also holds them together is an electronic publishing format that is still in the making, to produce something like an e-magazine that allows to include sound, text, and image, that clearly comes with the question from the present, or from a reading perspective from the present. What became crucial or helpful is to think the concept as two lines, a vertical and a horizontal line. And I'm coming from having a background in cinema and coming from a thinking and vocabulary that is very much informed by filmmaking, or the cinema complex. I see the horizontal line as a panning shot and the vertical line as that goes underground. But however, I suggest I will stop here and we'll switch to the slideshow or the still movie. And you will hear 4 different voices. It is recorded during a workshop we had in Trondheim in 2016. And you will hear that it's sometimes a bit informal for the way they are talking. And to be, so there are 4 voices, but the project it's much larger. So to be not so alone here or to sit so alone, I want to at least read the names once who are involved in more or way or another. And this is Kojo Eshun, Stacey Hardy, Ntone Jabe, John Akomfra, Marie-Hélène Gutberle, Gianel Tari, Nida Gous, Merkel Vasquez, Philippa César, Ibrahima Wane, Raphael Cressé, Graham Renze, Christopher Wessel, Ahmed Navas, and Laura Horelli, and several others more. So it's really, I'm just here as a kind of... I leave it like this and yeah, wish you a bit of also entertainment.
Ghetto youth is a jumping, uptown youth is stamping. Down through Nairobi, your Volta V is chanting like Bob Marley. We coming with the easy skanking. We are no gang, we are the top ranking. Yeah, Nairobi not light, but me I like electric power. Make this nation vibe go higher than the Eiffel Tower. Player hate me, okay, then sour me. I give me music in doses just like that.
Show me how they give you everything and not a little. Let me how they cut you, cause me sharper than a sickle. If you happy, call me happy, burn you till you sizzle. Make you feel so happy till you think that me a tickle. Get you so confused until you think that me a riddle. Y'all them want to lick me like an ice cream with the ripple. In me mellow sound, is a sound like a fiddle. Move it from the front to the back and then the middle. Now check out me sound, me happy crotty like a wizard. Then without a clue, me coming through like a needle. Blowing up the roof, coming through, keeping it true. This is how we do with the urge of our crew, no clang clang.
What does independence feel like at a distance? What are the connections replayed and transmitted at a distance? And how can the magazine render the epic event of inauguration? And in this case, Nyogi suggests inauguration as something like a simultaneity of sensorial states. An event whose birth pains, whose pains of coming into existence, are palpable as sensations which are available to be widely and vividly experienced by anyone that has the capacity to be affected. So to commemorate the formation of the nation to come implies the emergence of a new people whose forms of experience and expression will be as nascent as the nation itself. So the front cover of transition number 2 can be understood as a pictorial pattern of naissance, as in renaissance, naissance. It can be understood as a chromatic articulation of inauguration. What it announces is transition's modernist impulse to invent a poetics of Africanist internationalism, to invent an abstract Africanism that has emancipated itself from figuration and has advanced into the political abstraction of the present.
Tashkent, 1958. I try and imagine it for a moment. The first conference of the Afro-Asian writers is in session. Faiz Ahmad Faiz, the poet representing Pakistan, is there. I find archival images on the internet. W.E.B. Du Bois lecturing into a bunch of microphones, meeting with the Nigerian delegation, chatting with the Chinese, raising his arms in arms of affirmation with others. Non-alignment is in the air. They must have thought the future as theirs. Headsets in hands or pressed to the ear, translation devices hanging around their necks. Afro-Asian writers, Tashkent, 1958.
So that's Oliver Tambo, head of the ANC, and that's Ronald Segal. So Ronald Segal is the founding editor of Africa South, which starts in October-December 1956. Segal is a scion of a prominent Cape Townian Jewish garment family who is a Trotskyist. So he starts Africa South, and he wants it to be capacious, because he's like, there is no place where people are talking to each other or arguing with each other. And so he wants it to represent all of the factions that are in play at the time. Ruth First and Ronald Segal are incredibly close. And Ronald Segal, and actually, so what I meant to observe is that, when I showed the picture at the beginning of Ronald Segal and Oliver Tambo together, so what happens in March of 1960 is Sharpeville. And days after Sharpeville, or like the day after Sharpeville, Oliver Tambo and 5 people are smuggled out of the country and end up first in Dar es Salaam, ultimately in Dar es Salaam. Ronald Segal is one of them. The following issue is Africa South in Exile, which I think is fantastic, actually, as a way of tracking the movement. And this, of course, actually is a larger, nearly everyone that I'm going to talk about today ends up in exile, and many of them die in exile. So this is Profile of Zanzibar. 19 days, prisons of apartheid, Belgian Congo independence. Colin Legume, who Kojo mentioned yesterday, is a kind of Africa hand.
Is a brilliant and one of the most important books written in post-war Britain. Towards the end of this, Stuart Hall and the rest of his colleagues paused to look at 2 particular journals that emerged in Britain in the early to mid-70s. They look on one hand at the journal Race Today, and on the other hand, the journal The Black Liberator. The journal Race Today is in some sense still understood as a journal that effectively carries on the project of British Black Power and analyzes a kind of Caribbean lineage of thinking around a kind of a Marxist analysis of the role of the black proletariat in the post-war crisis. So figures such as C.L.R. James and Darcus Howe are key figures in the formulation of a Marxist discourse about the relation between the black proletariat in post-war Britain and the long-term industrial crisis that Britain enters into. So Race Today is still understood in those terms, but the other journal, Black Liberator, has largely been forgotten. And so in order to reconstruct that journal and part of its project, and to understand how it fitted into that moment and why it's of interest to us to think about that journal in the present, maybe you could reconstruct for us the milieu through which the journal emerges, its founding editor, Ricky Cambridge, and in a sense also narrate certain moments of your own biographical relation to that project of Black Liberator.
The Black Liberator was an indication of a drift which will had probably started in the late 60s and would become even more pronounced as the 70s went on, which is this desire for black autonomy, not with the magazine as a kind of tangible, as tangible evidence of that autonomy, and also the machinery for manufacturing that autonomy. We saw ourselves as black Marxists who were supposed to be very comfortable to be together on our own. and the question of margin or center bore no relation to that practice at all. We didn't care, and I remember that being one of the things that formed me anyway very strongly. So by the time you get to the early 80s, and these discussions are going on inside the Black Media Workers Association or the Independent Film Association or the London Filmmakers Co-op and the Artist Film Group, you could see that many of them, usually older than us, just couldn't understand where this desire to be alone came from. And I'm like, why are these kids so nuts? People say, don't you want to work in television? We're like, no, hell fucking no. Do you not want to be a media worker? I don't know. Happy to be exactly what and I think that confidence, that sense that the aura of autonomy had legitimacy and a value and a currency comes from that plunging into that world of black Marxism in the 70s.
kaddu sëñ bi benn kaddu dong la jar ma ne doom man tey lu ma seen kayit yi waaw dañu ma sàcc musiba mi ma doon seet fii fi laa doon xool ñu ne cas sama xaalis bi ma yoroon dara des xam nga ne lii metti na lool sëñ bi man maay bind kaddu di tasaare xam-xam bi pour ñëpp jot si da may nettali nu mu demee su ko defee ma bind ko fii daal di ko jox ñu jaay ko ci Sénégal yëpp ñëpp xam lu xew.
Okay, we ask a man who happens to be at the gate if this is the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau and whether it was from here that a periodical called Lotus had once been published. There's a big board above us for Dar el-Odaba. It's printed in white on blue in an angular or Kufic font of Arabic. On the side of the building that faces the road, there is also a relief of block letters that says Writer's House in English. But it seems to have exceeded itself as a sign. Though the structure is still intact, the color is nondescript, and one has to really look to notice it. We've brought along with us this old book my friend grew up with, a compilation of short stories translated from various languages into Arabic. We turn to the colophone and point to what is the same address, as if to legitimize our quest. We do this even though the man has already offered us a yes. Our demeanor towards him is casual and courteous, but I notice we are hesitant as well. We have no sense of what goes on in here these days, nor can we be certain what attitude awaits. Are we welcome? He ushers us in, tells us to go down the corridor, across the hall, and up the stairs. And what does it even mean for this to be the right place? We're in search of a magazine that is defunct and an editor who is dead. And I think, that's also interesting, again, thinking about this question of a permanent bureau that was established in Tashkent and then, ends up in Cairo, and then, as we will hear later, is kind of after 78, no longer the permanent bureau in Cairo, and then moves off to Beirut and then to Tunis, and then comes back and becomes permanent again.
Sorry, so you understand the Black Liberator as, you enter it as a reading group, as yes. part of a reading culture. Mm-hmm. And we've discussed how in the past we've discussed how Black liberation struggles are a reading culture, to the extent that all kinds of figures felt authorized and able, the capacity to generalize from one's own autobiographical context into a context which indicts a whole society. Yeah. becomes critical. And the transposition from a George Jackson text in the United States to Althusserian text in Britain to a reading group that will draw a variety of younger and older intellectuals in a non-academic setting. That's quite powerful for us because it suggests that here a magazine is functioning as a kind of a social condenser and as a as what we would now call a para-academic space. And so the idea that you've embraced Althusserian theory not for not for a degree, not for accreditation, but for its own sake.
Randolph Vine is one of the two founding editors of The New African, the Radical Monthly, which actually starts coming out more often at a certain point. But The New African is founded in January '62. It's edited out of Cape Town. The Classic is in Joburg. The New African is in Cape Town. Randolph Vine had been the literary editor of a journal called Contrast, which was published by the Liberal Party. There's a lot of political parties put out magazines. This is, so these journals that I'm talking about generally are not affiliated with a party that anyone knows. But Randolph Vine is part of a African resistance. It's called like the African resistance movement. But they actually engage in the bombers. They're sort of it's a predominantly white liberal group of saboteurs who are trying to bring like part of concerted efforts to destabilize the apartheid state in '63, '64. Which is why the New African ends up moving to London, because Randolph Vine has to flee the country in July '64. Interesting and relevant that the New African in a way that like transition. Well, these guys aren't poets. I will say the thing about the New African is that they're interested in politics and they're interested in left politics. So like the New African actually has a much different discursive space that it is working in, although it becomes more cultural. But I actually think it's kind of great that at the beginning that Goa is the subject of the opening line is like basically white indignation in South Africa over what India is doing in Goa is preposterous in the face of what South Africa is doing to its neighbors. So it uses kind of the international context as a manner of analyzing South Africa.
Thank you very much, Annette, and the whole electronic textures group for this presentation. I found very rich. Before leaving the microphone to the room, I just wanted to make a comment or ask a question about the technique of editing. That in a certain manner, so it's really, really present in everything that you showed us and in the whole proceeding of the group. And what proved to be super interesting to me was that this is a zone where magazines finally become a way to think and to work that is also open to other media. So the fact that cinema comes in there and that you work throughout what you showed us with music, so that voices are there, that people who will speak from other places and from the page, but finally find the same logic as a magazine because you're working in time, you're working with plurality of voices, and it's the fact how they are agencés, how they are juxtaposed and working together, that brings about a different way to conceive of the subject matter.
You mean to elaborate a bit of the process of editing? Yeah, that's, I mean, you you all said it already, I would say, but the it is actually, I mean, it's super simply done, no? I mean, really, that's yeah, it's kind of a cutout. The keynote makes it possible that you cut out and overlay images and sound, and you just cover the image of a conference video, and then you already end up with sound, and it was really this. It started as a trying out. So how is it possible to build these images? And I realized that it became important that they are still images, because that also to keep this to keep the idea of a reading moment. No, that you also can. It's not about the moving image, but it's then that it's still, and you can read it also. But the voice is doing something else, that the space becomes bigger. And there were these moments when I really started to trying to figure out who is there, like cutting out the names. With the magazines like the New African, or also I did this for Black Voice and many more, just to do something in reverse, to put all the names on the cover. What is normally these beautiful covers, no? We can have a whole day with just talking about covers, of course, but to do something and to try how to narrate this story of the so many. That was also a very important question. So that how to keep them, how to not fall permanently in this trap of telling the story of these great founding editors and this and that. So and these all these usual suspects, but to at least, if it's even not possible to have everybody like with his own proper story, but to keep a certain tension, or to keep them there as something that reminds you, but there, if you go in this direction, but there all these at the same time also present, and it's not possible to have all these stories at once, but still at least to create an image that this refers to it. So it's really this. There's kind of a thinking, and then to build this kind of contradiction and connections. For example, with the Black Liberator in Britain and the Cadre, that has been the Ousmane Sembène founded this magazine and was somehow at the same time. And then the funny thing is with Althusser, and you have then Plekhanov, and then you have these. Then you have all of a sudden this bridge between Britain, London, and Dakar, and. Sembène and this famous guy who, Mambeti, but who died, the artist, this great guy. Sorry, but yeah, thanks. So that to make connections that are not there in the magazines itself at the time, but with a certain distance. You can just do this. I mean, or to create something that creates a new echo, or that's kind of a bit.
Are there any questions in the room? No.
Can you say the next project with these movies, because I think it's not just a film or movies. Have you a project of edition, publication of this kind of, can you say something about that?
Yeah. That's indeed in the making. I mean, it will be something like e-magazine. So we wanted to keep the, at least for a funding period, to have something smaller that is at least for like 3 times, or to have something that reappears, or the period to keep the periodical idea. and not then have, in the end, again, a book, or then again you have this kind of, now we did all this, but, and the electronic, to somehow insist that it's electronic is also, of course, due to distribution, that it's much easier, and that also it seems to be something that somebody like Felwine Sarr in Dakar, who is very much promoting this like e-book that it can distribute very easily, and I mean, especially working with all these topic magazines and histories, to have something that doesn't end up in the fancy bookshops here, to have something that at least potentially could circulate differently. So that's a core idea also of the thing.
And that brings all the time together a perspective and a retrospective perspective. So what you just showed us is not just an interrogation. So in a certain manner, it is asking about in how far an archive can be activated and can be activated for something that will become a future publication, but that also inherits from something that is from the past. So one of your contributors and guys who participated in the discussion, Michael Vasquez, has been, for example, the editor of 2 historical magazines where he was constantly confronted to the question of how can, with such a big history, how can you inherit from that, and how will you translate it not only to the present, but like in the perspective of something that is a proposition.
Yeah, he was editor of Transition, and then when it was in New York, and Bidun also. Yeah, and when you mentioned the archive, and I think this is also a crucial point why this also allows us to do this. That there are meanwhile so many digitalized or accessible. So there is Souffle, there is Peuple Noir, Peuple Africain, there is Lotus, there's a huge thing ongoing in digitalizing this. So there is a lot there you can easily access online, like full issues. But it's as long as it's just there and nobody's interested, so it's kind of this activation, and then you get a certain glimpse of an idea, and then you can start research it and then go into depth. So, but of course, it's also this how far can you go into it, and how much do you then stick also on the surface? But it's there, no? And you can, and that resonates, or that communicates also a bit with each other, or should, yeah.
Which comes back to a question that we had in the morning, the question of the localization of a magazine. So in how far, in order to bring about a discourse that makes sense, you are in circles of people who know each other, but who also get to in interaction, in quite close interaction. And in a certain manner, what you're showing us is both. So these moments where you gather around the journals, around the magazines, that take time, that bring you together in one room, that bring people like from several contexts together in one room, allowed to think, to be in a conversation about these texts, about these objects, about these histories. And at the other hand, you try to bring them into a form that would allow them to circulate beyond these very specific moments in time and space.
Yeah, that's also crucial. That's true. I mean, these are precious moments, no? Also luxury to have these super busy people in one room for a few days. That's also a challenge, and that it's also in terms of to produce something like this publication. It takes a lot of time to get people in. I mean, it's how to create a working process to collect these contributions. That's the thing, and then how this what you just saw started is also, of course, coming from a certain, not desperation, but there has been there already so many things or sound, but it's a huge editing process, of course, to edit 4 days or 3 days of conversation, and then to condense it again and to recirculate it in a different form. Yeah. So working with resources, or what is? Yeah.
I see 2 questions. I would take those, and then Daya asked us to go into the next part of the panel. Right. Okay.
Hi. I really enjoy watching the film, and I'd like to follow up on the previous question about the e-magazine. What kind of content are you thinking about, and will you also be commissioning artwork? Yeah, or is it mostly textual, and are you thinking about like new articles, or is it also art historical content?
Yeah, we are working mainly with artists in the most broadest sense. So the contributions will be newly made. This is, for example, it's a mixture. So it will be how sound, text, and image can relate to each other. So, and this will be answered from every contribution, I hope, differently also. There will be interviews. There will be also focuses on, for example, this whole question of translation, which is crucial, and from the Anglophone to the Francophone and the Lusophone Africa, plus all the other languages that we speak even less. And so, for example, Ibrahim Abane will work with Kaddu, and he will doing 3 different interviews with people who were close or not so close, and but also have a selection of scans of this magazine. So it will be this mixture of something like a close reading in a way, but at the same time opening up, stuff like this. And 2 others are going through youth magazines in South Africa, upbeat from the 80s, and for them it has a very strong biographical connection because they were growing up with these. And for example, the graphic designer from Timorenga, the magazine that is published in South Africa, very interesting thing. He's the graphic designer of this magazine, so he will do, for example, the graphic design for the first e-publication, and is somehow. So his whole aesthetic is, for example, very much informed from this magazine Upbeat. So there's all these kind of connections that people work on certain topics who have kind of special relationship. So yeah, that's a bit of, and then there will be topics or issues relating to, for example, relative autonomy. Working with a notion of subculture underground, and to connect on the one hand a notion of like subculture which is not very much used, speaking of culture in the various countries, and then also but take it literally to going into soil, going into agriculture. So having these, we're working really with these connections and juxtapositions, and then having again something which is resonating with a topic. So that's a bit of structure.
We will take a last question and then stop. Do you have the microphone? It's in the middle, please.
The previous speaker kind of asked the question I was interested in, but you said that you have a website, and I was wondering how the contributors are informing you, letting you know that maybe some subjects could be added, and what are you looking for? Is it like in the spirit of cultural studies, bringing up confusion, awareness of diversity, proposing a new way of expressing, of writing, or creating reviews? What's the deal?
I think it was a misunderstanding. There is not yet a website. So for the question with the communication, it's simply emailing kind of a group or then singular. It's just contacting and emailing and organizing this communication. For the why or the kind of, I think there is already enough confusion. it's not this to add more confusion. I think it's not necessary anymore. Now it is there is of course a strong. There are different strong political interests, and it's really working with certain contradictions. And it's on the one hand, so with Michael Vasquez, there was also the huge question coming in with this whole complex of these so-called CCF magazines, for example. And then you're back in the Cold War struggles, and then you have, of course, the funding thing, and then you have interfering interests, and how can the systematic thing can be interfered with. Then again, how to use this kind of funding without ending up in a kind of straightforward narrative into conspiracy things. No, and yeah.
Maybe it's, I know that we're running late, and I have the impression, so the problem right now is that there's a huge research behind that, and an exhibition with a whole research program that is going on in Berlin right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And so in a certain manner, you're giving one, like in every word you say, there's 300 words behind in order to understand more or less what you're referring to. So maybe we're going to discuss in the break. Yeah. And then open up to the next session. We have 15 minutes of break, and we'll have the session with Zaya Ramani, with Clémentine Delis, that is arriving, with Céline Monsanti, just after the break. So see you in a minute.
Thanks a lot.